Most people lose their day before they even get out of bed. Not because they're lazy, not because they lack discipline, but because the first thoughts they accept in the morning aren't their own. They wake up and inherit yesterday's worries, tomorrow's fears, and a mind already moving without direction. And by the time they notice, they're no longer thinking, they're reacting. The Stoics understood this long before alarms and notifications existed. If you don't govern your mind early, you spend the rest of the day being governed by it. There's a quiet moment when you wake up where everything is still undecided. Your focus, your energy, even who you're going to be that day. Most people move past it without seeing it, but that moment holds more power than it seems. It's where intention can replace impulse, where clarity begins to silence noise. And once you notice it, something shifts. You start to understand that control isn't built later, when things get difficult. It's claimed early, when the mind is still open, still unshaped, still waiting for direction. Because the way you begin doesn't just influence the day, it defines it. The tone of your thoughts, the direction of your attention, the emotional weight you carry forward, all of it is decided before anything external even has a chance to reach you. And if that beginning is left unguarded, the rest of the day becomes a reaction to something you never chose. There's a small gap when you wake up, and almost nobody notices it. It doesn't feel important, it doesn't demand attention, and because of that, it quietly controls more than people realize. It lasts only a few seconds, maybe less. You're not fully thinking yet, not fully reacting, just existing in a neutral space between sleep and awareness. Most people pass through it without noticing, moving straight into habit, into noise, into whatever their mind decides to run first. But that gap is where control actually lives. Not later in the day when things get difficult. Right there, in that quiet space before anything has formed. Because before your mind starts replaying worries, before it pulls in stress, before it rebuilds yesterday's identity, there is silence. Not empty silence, but open silence. The kind that allows something to enter and take shape. And what enters first doesn't just pass through, it settles. It becomes the foundation for everything that follows. Your thinking, your attention, your emotional state. It all begins there. And because it happens so quickly, people assume it's random. But it's not. It's patterned. The first thought arrives automatically. Not because it's true, not because it's useful, but because it's familiar. Your mind pulls from what it already knows. Old patterns, old narratives, the same script running in the background for years. It doesn't question it, it just loads it. And if nothing interrupts that process, the day unfolds along those same lines. This is where things quietly split. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in a way that changes direction. If you let that first thought lead, everything follows. Your emotions align with it. Your focus bends toward it. Your actions reflect it. It becomes the lens through which you see the day, and by the time you notice it, you're already inside it. But if you interrupt that moment, even once, something changes. Not completely, but enough. You notice the thought instead of merging with it. You pause, and in that pause, something opens. A small distance between you and the pattern, and in that space, you can choose. Now here's where it gets deeper. Even if you start choosing your thoughts, most people still lose control in another way. Not through what they think, but through how fast they think. The moment they wake up, their mind is already moving too quickly, jumping ahead, planning everything, anticipating problems that haven't happened yet. It feels productive, but it's not. It's panic, just organized. Because when your thoughts move too fast, your body follows, your breathing shortens, your muscles tighten, your focus scatters, and now you're reacting before anything has even happened. Most people try to keep up with that speed. They match it, they chase it, but you can't control something you're chasing. So instead of speeding up, you slow it down, not physically, mentally. You let one thought finish before moving to the next. You let your breathing settle. You stop your mind from sprinting ahead. And in that stillness, clarity begins to return, because a calm mind sees clearly. A fast mind just reacts. And even when you slow it down, something else can take over if you're not careful. Noise, it doesn't start loud, it starts small. A thought you revisit, a worry you don't resolve, a distraction you entertain just a little too long. But it multiplies. 1 becomes 5, 5 becomes 20. And before the day even starts, your mind feels crowded. The worst part is you don't even remember what started it. That's how noise works. It fills space without adding anything. And in the morning, space is everything. Because whatever fills it early echoes through the rest of your day, into your conversations, into your decisions, into the moments that actually matter. So instead of letting it grow, you cut it off early. You don't ignore it, you acknowledge it and let it go immediately, because what you give attention to expands, and what you remove early never gets the chance to take over. But even after all that, there's something deeper that controls most people. Emotion, not the obvious kind, but the subtle ones. Waking up slightly off, a little anxious, a little heavy, and then letting that feeling decide everything that follows. If you feel tired, you move slower. If you feel stressed, you hold back. If you don't feel ready, you wait. But those feelings aren't always accurate. They're temporary, just chemistry, just your system adjusting. And if you treat them like commands, they take control. So instead of reacting to how you feel, you build stability first. Before anything tests you, you slow your breathing, you ground yourself, you decide how you're going to show up, not to feel perfect, but to feel steady. Because when you're steady, you don't collapse when something goes wrong, you adjust. And at that point, you don't need more discipline, you don't need more motivation, you need direction. One clear thought is enough. Not 10, not 20, 1. Something strong enough to carry the day. You choose it before anything else chooses for you, and you return to it, again and again, until it stops being something you say and starts becoming something you are. And once that happens, everything else begins to align. Decisions become clearer. Distractions lose power. Doubt has less space to grow. And if you're serious about building that kind of awareness, then stay connected to this space. Consider subscribing, not as a habit, but as a commitment to thinking more clearly, living more deliberately, and becoming someone who leads their own mind before anything else does. It builds gradually, almost quietly, but it builds in a way that compounds. One moment of awareness leads to another. One interruption leads to a new pattern, and over time, those patterns begin to replace the old ones. Not completely, not instantly, but enough to change the direction you're moving in. And the more you practice it, the clearer it becomes that control isn't something you find later in the day when everything is already moving fast. It's something you claim early, when things are still slow, still quiet, still open. That's where it's easiest. That's where it's most available. And that's where it matters most. So when you wake up tomorrow, before anything else takes over, there's just one thing to notice. That moment, that silence, that space where nothing has been decided yet. And in that space, ask yourself clearly and honestly, without rushing past it, did you choose your first thought, or did it choose you? Now here's the part people don't like to admit. Your mind doesn't filter anything for you. It doesn't pause and decide what's useful and what's not. It doesn't protect you from the thoughts that drain you. It simply takes everything in. Every memory that didn't get closure, every fear that never got resolved, every unfinished conversation that still lingers somewhere in the background. Even imagined problems that haven't happened yet find their way in. And in the morning, when your awareness is still forming, your mind is at its most open. Like a door with no lock, no guard, no system in place to decide what should enter and what should stay outside. So if you're not standing at that door, even for a moment, everything walks in. Not in order, not one at a time, but all at once. And it's never the calm, balanced thoughts that arrive first. It's the heavy ones, the urgent ones, the ones that feel like they need attention immediately. That's how your mind is wired. It scans for problems, for threats, for anything that might require action. That instinct was designed to keep you alive. But now, it overwhelms you before the day even begins. You've felt it, even if you didn't stop to think about it. You wake up, and within minutes, something small starts to grow. A simple thought connects to another, then another, until suddenly your mind feels crowded, tense, and heavy. Not because anything real has happened yet, but because something was allowed to stay. It wasn't filtered, it wasn't questioned, it was accepted. And once it was accepted, it started spreading. This is where the real shift happens, not in stopping thoughts from appearing, because that's impossible. Your mind will always generate ideas, memories, scenarios. That's its nature. Trying to shut that down only creates resistance. The Stoics understood this clearly. They didn't try to eliminate thoughts. They didn't try to silence the mind completely. What they focused on instead was what happened after the thought appeared. They made a distinction most people ignore, the difference between a thought arriving and a thought being accepted. One is automatic, the other is a decision, and that decision is where control lives. Because once a thought stays, it doesn't remain isolated. It connects, it grows, it begins shaping how you feel, how you interpret things, how you move through the next moments of your day. And the longer it stays, the harder it becomes to remove. It spreads quietly at first, then more aggressively, until it becomes your emotional baseline. That's why speed matters. Not rushing, not reacting impulsively, but responding early. Recognizing a thought the moment it appears and deciding what to do with it before it builds momentum. When a thought shows up, this day is going to be stressful. You're not ready. Something will go wrong. It feels convincing. It feels like something you should prepare for. But in reality, it's just a suggestion, one of many your mind will offer. And if you accept it without question, it starts shaping your behavior immediately. You become more tense, more cautious, more reactive. Not because the day actually is stressful, but because you've already decided that it is. As Marcus Aurelius said, the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. That quality isn't determined by what appears in your mind, but by what you choose to keep there. So instead of arguing with these thoughts, instead of trying to prove them wrong or push them away, you replace them, quickly, intentionally, not with forced positivity, not with something fake, but with something stronger, something grounded. Because the longer you engage with a thought that weakens you, the more it strengthens its position in your mind. And once it spreads, it's no longer just a thought. It becomes your state. This is what most people miss. They think their emotional state just happens to them. Something random, something they have to deal with later. But most of the time, it started with a single thought that was allowed to stay too long. A thought that wasn't challenged, wasn't redirected, wasn't replaced. Over time, this changes the way your mind operates. Not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually. You start noticing thoughts earlier. You become more selective. You stop treating every idea as something you need to explore. And instead, you guide your attention more deliberately. It becomes less about controlling everything and more about choosing direction. You're not forcing your mind to behave. You're deciding what it builds around. And that decision starts early, when your mind is still open, still forming, still responsive. Because in that state, small choices carry more weight. A single thought handled correctly can prevent an entire chain from forming. A single moment of awareness can stop a pattern before it even begins. So as the day begins and those first thoughts start to enter, there's a quiet responsibility that comes with awareness. Not to control everything, not to eliminate every negative idea, but to stand at that door, even briefly, and choose. Are you letting your mind collect whatever shows up? Or are you deciding what gets to live there? But even if you start choosing your thoughts, even if you begin to notice what enters and what stays, there's another problem that quietly takes over, and most people don't recognize it because it feels like progress. Speed. The moment you wake up, your mind is already moving too fast. It jumps ahead before you even have a chance to ground yourself. It starts planning, organizing, anticipating everything that could go wrong before anything has actually happened. It runs through conversations, responsibilities, expectations, possibilities. It feels productive. It feels like you're getting ahead, but you're not. It's panic, just organized in a way that makes it look useful. Because when your thoughts move too fast, your body follows. Your breathing shortens without you noticing. Your muscles tighten slightly, then more. Your attention becomes scattered, jumping from one thing to another without ever settling long enough to fully process anything. And now, before the day has even started, you're already reacting. Not to reality, but to a version of reality your mind is creating at high speed. You're trying to solve problems that don't exist yet, preparing for outcomes that may never happen, exhausting yourself before you've even begun. Most people respond to this by trying to keep up. They push themselves to think faster, move faster, act faster. They match the pace of their thoughts instead of questioning it. But you can't control something you're chasing. The faster your mind runs, the less control you have over it. It pulls you forward, drags your attention, dictates your state. And the more you try to keep up, the more you reinforce that speed as normal. This is where the difference begins to show, not in how much you do, but in how you start. The Stoics understood that control doesn't come from matching the speed of your thoughts. It comes from stepping out of it. They didn't rush into thinking. They didn't let their mind sprint the moment they woke up. They slowed down first, deliberately, even when everything around them pushed toward urgency. Not physically, but mentally. They allowed their mind to settle before asking it to perform, one thought at a time, one breath at a time, not because they had nothing to do, but because they understood something most people ignore. A calm mind sees clearly. A fast mind just reacts. When your mind is moving fast, everything feels urgent, everything feels important. You lose the ability to distinguish between what actually matters and what just feels intense in the moment. And when everything feels important, nothing is handled properly. You move quickly but without direction. You act but without clarity. Slowing down interrupts that. It creates space between thoughts. Space where you can observe instead of react. Space where you can decide instead of follow. And in that space something changes. Your breathing steadies. Your body relaxes slightly. Your attention stops scattering and starts focusing. You're no longer being pulled forward by your thoughts. You're standing with them, looking at them, choosing how to respond. That's control. And it doesn't come from doing more. It comes from doing less, but with intention. As Seneca wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." That waste doesn't just happen in big decisions or obvious distractions. It happens in moments like this, when your mind races through possibilities instead of settling into what's actually in front of you. When you spend energy reacting to imagined futures instead of directing your attention in the present. So instead of asking what you need to do today, there's a quieter, more important question to consider. Why is your mind rushing? Because that speed isn't random. It comes from something. Pressure, expectation, habit, fear. Something is pushing your thoughts to move faster than they need to. And until you recognize that, you'll keep trying to manage the speed instead of addressing the cause. But once you notice it, you can interrupt it. Not by forcing yourself to stop thinking, but by slowing the pace of your attention, letting one thought finish before moving to the next, letting one breath settle before taking another. It feels almost unnatural at first, because you're used to constant movement, constant stimulation. But that stillness is where clarity begins. One thought becomes 5, 5 become 20. Not because you chose to expand them, but because your mind connects everything automatically. It builds associations, creates links, pulls in related memories, similar fears, past experiences that match the same emotional tone. And before you realize it, your mind feels crowded. Not with clarity, not with direction, but with noise. And this all happens before the day has even properly started. The worst part is, you often don't even remember what started it. You can feel the weight, the distraction, the lack of focus, but you can't trace it back to its origin. That's how noise works. It doesn't need a clear beginning to take over, it just needs space. And once it has that space, it fills it completely, without adding anything useful in return. In the morning, that space matters more than at any other time, because your mind is still forming its direction. It hasn't fully committed to a state yet. It's still flexible, still open, still responsive. And whatever fills that space early doesn't stay contained to that moment. It echoes. It carries forward into everything else, into how you speak, how you listen, how you decide, how you react. It becomes part of your baseline without you consciously choosing it. So what most people end up doing is carrying that noise with them. They don't notice it directly, but they feel its effects. They enter conversations already distracted, already partially somewhere else. They make decisions without full clarity. They move through important moments half present, split between what's in front of them and what's looping in their mind. And because it's internal, because it's not visible, they assume it's just how things are. But it doesn't have to be. The Stoics didn't try to eliminate noise entirely. They understood that thoughts will always appear, that the mind will always generate ideas, concerns, possibilities. That's part of being aware. What they focused on instead was stopping that noise before it had a chance to grow. Not later, when it becomes overwhelming, but early, when it's still small enough to handle. They didn't ignore it. Ignoring doesn't work. What you ignore tends to return, often stronger than before. Instead, they acknowledged it. They saw it clearly for what it was, a passing thought, not a command, not a truth, not something that needed to be explored endlessly. And once they recognized it, they let it go, immediately. Not after analyzing it, not after giving it time to expand, right when it appeared. Because every second you spend engaging with unnecessary noise is a second you're feeding it. And what you feed grows. That's the part that's easy to overlook. It's not the thought itself that creates the problem. It's the attention you give it. Attention acts like fuel. It turns something small into something persistent. It gives it energy, space, importance. And once it has that, it becomes harder to remove. Not because it's inherently powerful, but because you've made it that way. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. That estimate begins internally, in how much attention you give to something that may not deserve it. And once that attention is given, it shapes your experience, regardless of whether the original thought had any real significance. So cutting off noise isn't about suppressing thoughts or pretending they don't exist. It's about refusing to invest in them, realizing when something is unnecessary, when it doesn't move you forward, when it doesn't add clarity, and choosing not to give it more time than it deserves. That choice, made early, changes everything. Because when you remove noise before it multiplies, you protect something much more valuable, clarity. So, as the day begins and thoughts start to appear, there's a quiet decision that repeats itself over and over. Not dramatic, not obvious, but important. A thought comes in, and instead of following it automatically, you pause just long enough to see it. And then you decide, does this deserve my attention? Or is this something that never needed to stay in the first place? Even if you clear the noise, even if you learn to filter your thoughts and stop unnecessary patterns from taking over, something deeper still controls most people, and it's harder to recognize because it doesn't always feel like something you can influence. Emotion. Not the obvious kind, not the intense moments that everyone can clearly identify, but the subtle ones that sit quietly in the background. The slight heaviness when you wake up, the quiet anxiety that doesn't have a clear reason, the low energy that makes everything feel just a little harder than it should. These don't demand attention, but they shape everything, and most people don't question them. They accept them as truth, as something that defines how the day will go. It shows up in small ways, almost automatic. If you feel tired, you move slower. If you feel stressed, you hesitate. If you don't feel ready, you delay. These reactions feel natural, almost logical, because they match what you're experiencing internally. But what if that internal state isn't accurate? What if it's not a reflection of reality, but just a temporary condition, a result of how your body is waking up, how your chemistry is balancing, how your mind is settling into awareness? Something that feels real, but isn't necessarily reliable. That's where the difference begins. Because if you treat every feeling as a command, you give it authority over your actions. You let it decide how you move, how you respond, how much effort you give. And without realizing it, you start building your day around something that was never meant to lead in the first place. A passing state becomes a defining force, not because it's strong, but because it was never questioned. The Stoics approached this differently. They didn't deny emotions. They didn't pretend they didn't exist or try to suppress them completely. What they understood was that emotions are signals, not instructions. They appear, they communicate something, but they don't get to decide what happens next unless you allow them to. That distinction changes everything, because when you observe a feeling instead of immediately reacting to it, you create space. You separate yourself from it, even if just slightly. You recognize that what you're experiencing is temporary, something passing through rather than something that defines you. And in that space, you gain the ability to choose your response instead of being carried by the feeling. As Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." That mastery doesn't come from eliminating emotions, but from not being controlled by them. From recognizing that feeling something doesn't mean you have to act on it. This becomes especially important in the morning, when your emotional state is still forming, when everything is still flexible, still open. If you let your emotions lead at that stage, they don't just influence a moment, they set the tone for everything that follows. A slight anxiety becomes a constant tension. A small sense of heaviness turns into a lack of motivation that carries through the day. Not because those feelings were accurate, but because they were given control too early. So instead of letting that happen, the focus shifts. Not toward feeling better immediately, not toward forcing positivity, but toward building stability. Before anything tests you, before anything demands a response, before the day introduces challenges that require clarity and control, you create a baseline, something steady that doesn't depend on how you woke up feeling. That stability can come from simple things. Stillness, sitting with your thoughts without reacting to them. Breathing, slowing your system down enough to bring your body back into balance. Intention, deciding how you're going to show up before anything else influences that decision. These aren't complicated techniques, but they serve a purpose. They anchor you. Not in perfection, but in steadiness. And that steadiness is what changes how you move through the rest of the day. Because when something goes wrong, when something unexpected happens, you're not starting from zero. You're not reacting from a place of instability. You're responding from a foundation you've already built. That doesn't mean you won't feel anything. It doesn't mean challenges won't affect you. But it means you won't collapse under them. You adjust instead. That's the difference. Most people wait to see how they feel before deciding how to act. They let their internal state determine their external behavior. And because that state is always changing, their actions become inconsistent. One day they move forward, the next they hesitate, not because anything meaningful changed, but because their feelings did. But when you build stability first, the direction stays the same even when the feelings shift. You act based on intention, not emotion. And over time, that changes the relationship you have with your internal state. You stop fearing it. You stop relying on it. You start seeing it for what it is, something that moves, something that changes, something that doesn't need to control you. So instead of asking how you feel the moment you wake up, there's a more useful question to hold on to. What state do you need to be in today? Because that question shifts the focus from observation to creation, from reacting to building. It places responsibility back in your hands, not in a heavy way, but in a way that gives you direction. And once you have that direction, you can begin to build toward it, slowly, deliberately, without rushing or forcing it. You align your thoughts, your breathing, your focus with that chosen state. And as you do that, the initial feeling that once seemed so important begins to lose its influence. It fades into the background, not because it disappeared completely, but because it no longer has control. And that's where real consistency begins. Not in eliminating emotions, but in not being led by them. Not in feeling perfect, but in being steady enough to move forward regardless. So as the morning unfolds and those subtle emotions begin to surface, there's a moment where you can pause and shift your approach. Not to ignore what you feel, not to fight it, but to recognize it without giving it authority. Because the question isn't how you feel, it's what you're going to build from here. At this point, most people try to fix everything at once. They wake up with the intention to be better, sharper, more disciplined, more focused, and they try to stack all of it together immediately. More control over thoughts, more motivation, more structure, more effort. It sounds productive. It feels like progress. But this is usually where they lose again. Not because they're doing nothing, but because they're trying to do too much at the same time. The mind doesn't respond well to overload, even when that overload is positive. It doesn't organize itself under pressure like that. It fragments. It gets pulled in multiple directions, trying to hold on to everything without fully committing to anything. Because the mind doesn't actually need more, it needs direction. Not 10 different ideas competing for attention. Not a long list of expectations that create pressure before the day even begins. Just one clear thought, one anchor, something simple enough to hold on to, but strong enough to influence everything else. That's where most people underestimate the power of simplicity. They assume that more effort means more control, but in reality, clarity creates control, and clarity comes from narrowing, not expanding. One thought is enough. Not because it solves everything, but because it organizes everything around it. The Stoics understood this better than most. They didn't try to manage every thought that appeared in their mind. They didn't try to control every emotional reaction or anticipate every possible outcome. Instead, they focused on choosing a single principle, a single idea that would guide their actions, and they let everything else align around it. That choice created consistency. It gave structure to their thinking without overwhelming it. That thought doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, it works better when it isn't. Something like finishing what you start, staying calm under pressure, keeping your focus no matter what shows up. It doesn't matter what the exact wording is. What matters is that it resonates with you, that it feels solid enough to return to when things start pulling your attention in different directions. Because the moment you choose that thought, you're doing something most people don't do. You're deciding who you're going to be before the day has a chance to decide for you. And that decision matters more than most people realize. Without it, your mind drifts. It reacts to whatever is in front of it. It adjusts constantly based on circumstances, emotions, distractions. One moment you're focused, the next you're not. One moment you're confident, the next you're uncertain. Not because anything fundamentally changed, but because there was no anchor holding your direction steady. But once that thought is chosen, something shifts. You're no longer reacting to everything equally. You're filtering your actions through something intentional. When a distraction appears, it doesn't automatically pull you away because you have something to return to. When doubt shows up, it doesn't take over as easily because there's already a direction in place. As Seneca wrote, "If a man knows not to which port he sails, no wind is favorable." That applies internally just as much as it does externally. If your mind doesn't have a clear direction, every thought, every distraction, every emotion has the potential to shift you off course. But when that direction is set, everything else becomes easier to manage, not because it disappears, but because it loses its ability to control you. And that's where repetition becomes important. Not in a mechanical way, not as something forced, but as a way of reinforcing what you've chosen. You return to that thought throughout the morning, not because you forgot it, but because you're strengthening it. You're letting it settle deeper, letting it move from something you say to something you believe, and eventually to something you act on without hesitation. At first, it feels like effort. You have to remind yourself, bring your attention back, realign when you drift. But over time, it becomes natural. The thought starts to surface on its own in moments where you need it. It becomes part of how you think, not just something you repeat. And once that happens, decisions start to feel different. You don't hesitate as much because you're not starting from uncertainty. You're acting from something already established. Distractions lose their intensity because they don't match the direction you've chosen. Doubt still appears, but it doesn't take up as much space because it doesn't align with the identity you're building. That's the deeper layer most people miss. This isn't just about thinking differently for a day. It's about shaping identity over time. Because the thoughts you repeat consistently don't just influence your actions, they define how you see yourself. And how you see yourself determines how you act. So instead of trying to fix everything at once, instead of adding more pressure, more expectations, more complexity, the approach becomes simpler. You choose one thought. You hold on to it. You return to it when things start to drift, and you let it guide your actions, quietly, consistently. Because when everything is scattered, progress feels random. But when everything is aligned, even small actions start to build in the same direction. So as the day begins and your mind starts to move, there's a moment where you can set that direction, not with a long list, not with complicated plans, but with one clear idea that you're willing to carry with you. And once it's set, the rest begins to organize itself around it. So the question becomes simple, but important. What is the one thought you're building your entire day on? Now imagine this. You have a deadline, not the kind tied to work or expectations from others, but one that exists entirely for you. A quiet line in time that most people never draw, but the moment you do, everything begins to organize itself differently. Let's say it's 7:59 a.m. Before that moment, you belong to yourself. Your thoughts are still flexible. Your attention hasn't been claimed. Your state hasn't been shaped by the outside world. But once that moment passes, the world begins to ask for you. Messages, responsibilities, conversations, pressure. Things that pull you outward, whether you're ready or not. Most people never define that boundary, so their morning drifts without direction. 1 minute turns into 10, 10 into 30. They stay in bed a little longer, scroll a little more, think without structure, delay without noticing. They tell themselves they'll get focused later, that clarity will come once the day gets going. But later never arrives the way they expect it to. Because once the day starts moving, it doesn't pause for you to catch up. It continues, and you enter it in whatever state you happen to be in. And that state is rarely intentional. Without a boundary, you don't prepare, you react. You don't decide, you adjust. You don't lead your day, you follow whatever demands your attention first. Not because you lack discipline, but because you never created the moment where discipline was required. You never forced a decision before everything else began. The Stoics didn't rely on motivation to solve this. They didn't wait until they felt ready or inspired. They understood that motivation is unreliable, that it fades, that it changes. So instead of depending on it, they created pressure. Not external pressure, but something internal, a boundary that couldn't be negotiated with, a moment where the work had to be done. That work wasn't complicated. It wasn't about perfection or achieving some ideal state. It was about alignment.